Well, hello and welcome to the Hoon. I am Bernard Hickey, and joining me is co-host Peter Bale. Peter, great to see you.
Bernard, it's excellent to see you too. You're slightly pixelated where I am, but hopefully we will make this work this time. I'm told that the post reconstruction version last week with Simon was actually really good, but I'm very grateful for everybody who stayed on and was patient with us last week as we try to professionalize this without removing some of the spontaneity.
Yes, we're on the high wire and we're clinging on and smiling as we do it.
Well, Bernard, I was actually also really struck. I met a chap called Steve who will be in the audience, I hope, yesterday on the ferry home from Waiheke. And he said, "You're Peter Bale, aren't you? I really like this podcast, Hoon. I'm a really loyal listener." And he gave us a good, he said he didn't mind the fuck ups that we had last week, and he was very kind about that. And then last night I was at an event at the Spin-Off and met another chap who said, "Oh, that Hoon is just bloody fantastic." So,
Wow,
if I
that's
can bump into two people in one day in Auckland, probably in the on one on the ferry and one at some sort of slightly left wing media outlet, we're doing all right, I think, or we're doing
yes,
something.
and we are doing something. It is really lovely to see you all. And Peter, we're going to start off with you, and in particular, jumping into the international
No, no,
events.
no, 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 no. You've got it slightly round the wrong
Oh,
way, Bernard. Because I think our running order is
oh,
actually
yes,
well, and
yes,
it's international. It's the International Panel on Climate Change,
yes.
and they're warning this week that 1.5 is at risk, and that this is we're in what a guy called David Mellor once described who was a ridiculous cabinet minister in England, described as the last chance saloon. And I think we've got Bronwyn on to talk about that. We'll talk about some New Zealand stories, including Wayne Brown ghosting everybody and talking about getting pissed and not doing it on the taxpayer's dollar, which is pretty ironic knowing him. And I thought we might also talk about this Prebble story about a Labour coup, Bernard, Luxon on
Mm,
education. And at 5:30, we're going to bring in the rather amazing friend of mine, Natalia Antalava from Coda Story in Georgia in Tbilisi, to talk about Georgia, why we probably should have stopped Putin in 2008 but chose not to, what the consequences of that are, and then her observations about, she's a long standing observer reporter about Putin. She covered the downing of the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine. She's right across the story, and I think she will be a fabulous combination with our old friend of the pod, as they say on the proper podcasts, Professor Robert Patman, who everybody loves.
yeah, no, we're really looking forward to a big week this week, and in particular, the IPCC report, which didn't get an enormous amount of coverage, and maybe it should have. And we're very
Oh,
lucky.
absolutely. I think it should have, yeah.
Yeah, we're very lucky this week to hopefully have Bronwyn Hayward on. She is the political science and environment academic at Canterbury University who
Hmm.
actually helped write the IPCC report. And she'll be able to tell us what that means. She is a very wide-ranging view on this, but also gets into the weeds of
Yeah.
what has actually gone on with the IPCC
Yeah,
report.
it's quite interesting, but I've been trying to test one of Robert Patman's theories this week, which I will talk about. Which it's not really, it doesn't. I haven't done it yet. But for the North and South, for my next North and South column, I'm doing a story about the High Seas Treaty, which New Zealand was quite instrumental on. I want to be really careful about these kind of plucky little New Zealand, cuts across and manages to have a multilateral approach where everybody, are big bullies and we just slice through. But actually, there's some truth in that, and it sounds like Bronwyn really does that as well. It's a really interesting idea that that sort of climate diplomacy, environmental diplomacy is something that New Zealand's actually very, very good at. You might remember Chris Beebe when we were kids, who was very prominent in the Antarctic Treaty and the Law of the Seas. So New Zealand does have, and also of course New Zealand has I think the second largest economic zone in the world in the oceans. So we have a really good stake in this, and of course New Zealand was instrumental in. Sorry, thanks, Sharon. I'll turn that up a bit if you like. Instrumental in the ozone pact, or in the pact, to reduce chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. in order to deal with the ozone layer. And I find that a very constructive way to deal. Oh, there's Bronwyn.
Oh,
Bronwyn,
fantastic.
I'm Peter Bale. I don't think we've met yet. I was just saying that I was interviewing Victoria Hallam this week from MFAT about the High Seas Treaty, and Bernard has been with now about how prominent you are with the IPCC, and it's very interesting to me this idea that New Zealand can have a prominent role in what you might call climate and environmental diplomacy.
I'm not sure if it's prominent, but actually I will say that Helen Plume from the Ministry for the Environment, who's the government representative, so I'm independent on the science side, so it's just coincidental that I'm a New Zealander rather than I represent New Zealand. But Helen has served New Zealand for many years, and this has been her last meeting for the IPCC. She served on amazing number of environmental initiatives as a diplomat and a science voice, and it was a privilege to watch her in action at this round of meetings. Mm-hmm. She's very calm and very judicious, and her voice just cuts through a very crowded environment tension. It's quite remarkable.
So Bronwyn, I was wondering if you could give us the good juice on what was new in the IPCC report this week, and in particular, what message people were trying to get across.
Well, not a lot of the report is actually new, but what it does is it summarizes the last 6 years, well, the 8 years worth of work, but the 6 reports that we've produced. But what is special about this report is that it's a sort of a short version of thousands of pages where governments sign off line by line which of the key policy messages they will agree to collectively, and the framing of that they can agree to.
Yeah. Yes,
we've got
still
you there,
and we've still got you. Thanks
I'm not quite sure how I turn the phone off at the same time, having not done Riverside before. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah, so what's different about this is that the governments have decided, in particular, one of the key issues is I'm not quite sure how I block phone calls at the same time as talk to you on the phone.
It's probably Antonio Guterres, and you probably need to hang up and take him, but carry on. Don't worry, we're all getting used to this.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that the governments have agreed that it's this decade that's critical, and that's really important language, because they could have argued that the next 20 years matters, but they collectively agreed it's what we're doing now that counts. They also collectively agreed that with the science that we will, as likely as not, break through the 1.5 in the early 2030s, certainly before 2040. And they also agreed that best practice is what we call in climate resilient development, which is the integration of adaptation and mitigation action. And that, and interestingly, they also all agreed, and that's 196 countries, that those decision-making practices are best when they are inclusive, and that when they're informed by local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. So there's been a big emphasis on Indigenous knowledge in this round of reports. They've also emphasised this role of cities as being a site globally for solutions. So I think because our profile is so skewed towards agriculture, there's a couple of big things that we've lost sight of as a country. We've lost sight of the fact that 70% of global carbon emissions come from cities. So cities are a really significant site of climate leadership, and that makes things a bit more achievable for people who are feeling overwhelmed. We really need climate leadership at the level of mayors and councillors and community groups. But they have also agreed that methane matters, that if we're going to try and get our emissions down, it's an and, not an and then. So we need to use all the tools we've got to reduce emissions. And because methane is a fierce, fast-acting gas, it is important that we reduce methane from all sources now. And rapid and deep emissions apply to methane as well. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time on social media today dealing with colleagues who in agriculture who are quite frustrated about this, but we can't will it away. We have a really difficult situation that a significant proportion of our emissions are from biogenic methane. And it's not okay to keep saying, well, this is a different kind of gas, it doesn't last long. This isn't washing in an international environment where we are really so slow to reduce our emissions that, yes, carbon is the big core gas that we have to reduce. It lasts forever. But we also, the fierce effects of methane and their high warming potential means we also have to reduce them in the short term. And this is a very difficult debate for farming.
Bronwyn, I wanted to ask about how that increased emphasis on doing things fast in the next decade changes things for New Zealand. Obviously, that means methane is almost more important because it has a bigger impact early on, and you can't just sort of wait for it to go away in future to solve your problems. You have to use it as an opportunity to solve your problems now. And it also means that the typical political response when dealing with difficult issues like this is to put off the decision, to say, well, we've got time to do this, we'll deal with it later. And later is always better than now when you've got these sorts of problems. But what it seems to me, the message from the IPCC report this time is, we don't have time to put it off. We actually have to front load our action in the next 5 or 6 years if we're going to, really avoid some of the worst pain.
Yes, I think that one of the things that's also different about this language that was debated is and agreed by countries. So this isn't me. This is not the IPCC being activists, as I saw a couple of people said. They've really jumped the shark. This is what the 196 governments signed off. And so it's not the scientists saying this. This is this government's agreed synthesis report. And so this is the new reality that New Zealand's going to have to deal with in its international diplomacy. One of the new realities is just the language of effect. So the government's agreed to say the choices and actions we make now will last for thousands of years. So they're affecting current generations and thousands, and it's very hard to get your head around. Every increment of warming matters. So even if we are going through 1.5, it's still better to live in a 1.7 world than a 2. And heaven's not a 2.8.
Bronwyn, I was really struck by that. There was a very, very good Financial Times piece about staying within the 1.5. And it showed, as they've done very well in terms of data journalism, and I can send it to you, but I'm sure you know it, but I'd love to address it, the exponential change between 1.5 and 2. It isn't just like it's only half a degree, because it's all going up on a logarithmic basis. So it just the difference between the impact of 1.5 and 2 is gigantic.
Yes, and it's the intensity of the storms, the length of the droughts, and the fact that that's happening now. I think it's really interesting you should say that about the Financial Times, because I've been following them closely, and they really have nailed a lot of this. And I think that's because the insurance industry and their readers and business investment is thinking about this. It's not, but dialing back to this question of what this means for New Zealand, it does mean that the nature of the conversations and the actions with our trading partners, with our countries that we like to align ourselves with, is changing fast. So there is a big focus on the human rights effects of these changes. There is a much greater focus on loss and damages, which opens up conversations about liability. Countries are not there at accepting liability, I should say, but they have accepted that there are inevitable losses and damages, ones we've already witnessed and ones that are coming. On the methane question, I think, well, not just methane, also carbon and transport for cities. I don't think New Zealand realises what an outlier we are now. We are one of just a tiny number of countries who are not reducing our emissions. And that has a twofold effect. It means that within the country, people think, oh, this is too hard and impossible. Look, no one's doing it.
Or it doesn't matter if we do it because
I don't
we're the
think
equivalent of
fast
a neighbourhood in Beijing.
Yeah, well, let's be fast followers. Look, it would be great if we were following someone, but we're not. We're out way on our own, just continuing to do business as usual, Everyone else is reducing their emissions, even the neighbourhoods in Beijing, particularly the neighbourhoods in Beijing. We can debate whether or not those are being accurately recorded, but there is much more intensity on the recording and focus of that. The US is reducing their emissions. They did so under Trump at a city level. They did so regionally. The UK is reducing their emissions. They have done for over a decade. So is the US. So we are in a very precarious position now to keep saying, oh, this is too hard. We need a special consideration for methane. Why should our dairy industry be given a special consideration and Norway or Saudi Arabia's oil and coal industries not? So,
well, yeah.
Why should we keep blaming?
Without it's very difficult with you. How do we avoid taking you into a political area in this? Because if you, I presume you do actually advise the government to some extent on climate policy.
I can honestly say the government has never. The only political party that's ever picked up the phone and asked me anything is National.
Yeah.
So just as a quiet aside, I'm always happy to talk to anybody, but I am a political scientist, and we cannot. I mean, I can speak both to the IPCC, but also we cannot. It's not activism now to talk about this in a way, and when we're thinking about the policy choices. Now, the IPCC has to be careful. It only presents the range of choices that are available to governments. But now that governments have signed up to them, then now my 8 years work for the IPCC is finished. It is my role as a member of the Royal Society, as a policy analyst, as a political scientist, to talk about the implications of what that means. And so, it's not activism, it's just realism.
So Bronwyn, I was wondering, if I'm a citizen, a voter, and I'm thinking, okay, well, let's address this. Let's try to front load our emissions reductions, address methane, get our emissions from transport in the cities down. What sort of policies should we be pursuing? And more importantly, what are the policies that are happening at the moment that we need to stop?
Well, one of the good things, the last figure 7, which is a wee bit difficult to follow, it's a bar graph, but one of the things it finally does is say, look, what are the key policies that you can really make a big difference on? And one of them is around energy policies. So in the city context, that means reducing your fossil fuel emission transport, thinking about using your urban planning tools to make sure your cities are more compact, but also greener, to keep them cooler, to keep them safer as ways of absorbing heat and water and flooding, and to move to ensure that you're not continuing to build in places of high risk. A lot of cities have developed plans, particularly focused on physical infrastructure, but it's thinking about your green infrastructure and your social support for communities who are inevitably going to be hurt. Particularly, this IPCC report says if you've got very little funding, target your funding at the most economically and socially vulnerable, because they're going to be the ones, and we've seen it already with Gisborne and these repeated impacts of the flooding from Gabriel. At the farming level, this is a really tricky debate. It means that we have to look very hard at the argument that we should just wait for new technology that will reduce our methane impact, because it's this decade that counts. And the point of targeting methane is to get the quick hard fix. So that means thinking about how we actually support our agriculture to move away from higher methane dairy and deer farming, how we support a transition to other forms of agriculture that are going to actually really reduce farming impacts. And He Waka Eke Noa has some great steps in it, actually, how we make that really real now. And that
Bronwyn,
is
may I
going
ask,
to get
how much of this is just symbolic? Because one of the things that worries me when I look at what James Shaw has signed up to, and the level of commitment that's involved in the COP27 commitments that New Zealand has made, is towards offsetting this almost entirely, or to a huge extent, by buying offshore carbon credits, and in markets that don't exist. And I just, someone mentioned on our chat that talkback radio feeds into this as well, and public opinion feeds into it. I'm just cannot really believe that New Zealanders will accept $15 billion being invested in overseas carbon credits, and it's like a promise. It's sort of a promissory note for the future.
I agree, and I was intrigued by a comment that Adrian Macy made, and I haven't, because I literally only got back today, I haven't had a chance to talk to him, but his concern is that those carbon credits that we're purchasing seem to be divorced from our actual mitigation and adaptation goals. So one of the things that the report says in detail is that if you are using economic transfer mechanisms or redistribute, make sure that you can see the benefit, that people feel that there's a redistribution benefit that they can see.
Exactly, and that won't happen. I mean, I just cannot. Exactly, in New Zealand, that's going to become politically really febrile, isn't it?
Yes, but also internationally. I mean, every country is grappling with this. And we also want to know that those credits are real and are really making a difference. And that's increasingly hard when you get to huge numbers. It's increasingly a challenge. It has been from the beginning to make sure that those credits are really doing what we're hoping they're doing. But there's a lot of expertise in that. But in a way, we focused for so many years on emissions trading that there will be a place, there has to be a place for emissions trading, but the rest of the world has moved on.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Things like urban planning, you can't use emissions trading for land developers, for building. You actually have to use regulations and government decision making in order to reduce your emissions and protect your population.
Bronwyn, I wanted to ask then about the announcements this week about the emissions trading scheme. The Ministry of the Environment's going to do a review of, in particular, whether we can continue to have all of these pine forests planted, converting sheep and beef farms into pine forests to get hold of these credits. There's a report out that upwards of there could be a 30% increase in the size of our pine forests if people respond to the higher carbon credit prices we're supposed to be seeing. And questions have been asked about how we encourage people to do native forests as well, and also think less about using pine credits to save us the trouble of having to reduce our gross emissions. I wondered, what do you think about this sort of political economy problem of all of these forestry interests, including iwi, who say, well, we've got this land, we can plant these forests, we can get the money from the credits, win-win. What do you think?
I haven't had enough time to read it in detail because I've just been focusing on the bigger debate, but there's some big social license issues, and because the game has changed, like the debate is rapid reductions now that are real reductions. Just capturing your carbon is not reducing it. So for a start, we need to get our head around the fact that we need to produce less. And second, we need to think hard about the social license. So forestry has got a social license crisis in two fronts, pine forestry. It's slash crisis and it's social community impact crisis. No one wants to live next to an enormous bank of carbon for Air New Zealand. You can't run rural primary schools and rural services when so much of your land is covered in pine.
Bronwyn, if we've got clever people like you who know who have a good sense of the policy areas where the answers need to come from, Why isn't it happening? We've got clever people like you. We've got, good people in MFAT. Is it just a sort of lack of political understanding?
I think we've had a massive lobby process in New Zealand, and Guy Salmon put it really well, when he said in that documentary Hot Air that was made a few years ago, that we live in a company town. And basically it's been unwelcome comments, and we have really eroded social trust, so that it's very difficult to talk in a way that, oh, well, she's just a leftist, she doesn't understand farming, he's just a market, hawk or something. Actually, we do have to rebuild this social trust. And I think things like Stuff making an editorial agreement about how it's going to cover climate has made a huge difference for a national distribution. But we need the ZB networks and things to do this as well, because we've got enough problems with rabbit holes in social media. We can't be dealing with conspiracy theory and polarization around core topics that are of fundamental.
You mean we have to make as journalists, we have to make a commitment to the best science available.
These are issues of national security. These are issues where we have to say, look, I'm sure that you would like to pretend this isn't a problem, but it is. So let's accept that. I was staggered to be interviewed by ABC, and they said, but is climate change really real? I thought, how can we be still asking this in 2023?
I just wondered, Bronwyn, too, about this issue of the election coming up. We've got National saying, for example, this week that they would still not allow agriculture into the emissions trading scheme. We've got comments from the likes of Simeon Brown that there is a war on cars being launched by the government. This week, Wayne Brown, the Mayor of Auckland, announced cuts of $100 million to public transport spending, and also a whole bunch of community groups, not to mention the fact that he's decided to try and stop or slow down the building of new cycle lanes and walkways, and basically says that we need to be much more focused on helping car drivers retain car parks and move into roads that are much more efficient and less congested, and spend less time building transport networks. I mean, at what point do the so-called grown-ups, the elected representatives, at what point can we call bullshit on them?
About 20 years ago. We haven't. I mean, this is why I think the media matters as well. This is an easy culture war to have, and it will just put us back so far. It's bad enough that we had an urban-rural split. We have to get over that. But it's also not okay that we are still talking about magical technology, that we're not talking about integrated decision-making. No party is at the moment. No party is really talking about fundamentally integrating our actions to cut emissions with our actions to protect people. And I honestly don't know. It's a little bit of an existential crisis for me, actually, coming back and teaching politics today to a lovely group of Stage 1 students who are all young leaders. And I think, bloody hell.
Well, I think we have the right podcast for you to appear on regularly, Bronwyn, if you want to. I mean, we'll do an environment. I mean, you're so. What are you going to do with not being on the IPCC anymore?
Well, I'm not going to do anything for a week or two. But one of the things I think really matters is now, and watching how the world's debates are going, and every country's having the same debate, that we have to get some good practice out there and show what we can do. So we've got a fantastic project following children growing up in cities around the world, and how we can intervene in those cities to give people quality of life in low carbon ways. And getting those results out matters very much. We've got a project that was funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council with Surrey and 5 other partner universities. And we've got a project that's funded by the Deep South, supporting Pacific and Māori young leaders, because their communities will be at the front line. So it's thinking about how we build capacity for new leadership. But that has to happen fast. And in the meantime, I've turned my research group into a charitable think tank, because I just think for longer term future generations, these issues really matter now. And it just allows me to put consultancy funding into new, young leaders that are coming through in their research scholarships. And so bringing it home, really, I just think focusing very intensely on projects that work matters.
Bronwyn,
and I
thank
think
you.
you've got wonderful Robert Patman about to be. I wished Robert had been with us in many of the international
we think of him as wonderful Robert Patman
debates.
too. And now we think of you as fabulous Bronwyn Hayward. Yeah.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
No,
really
thanks,
good to
Bronwyn.
chat.
Really, we might come back to you on the media question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bernard, did you see my WhatsApp to you about our other guest?
Yes, we've. No, I'm sorry, I've missed that.
Natalia doesn't have her link,
yes.
as it were.
Oh, I sent it to her. Yeah, to her email. Yep.
Flick it to me, and I'll give it to her, and we'll talk to Robert.
Cool.
White noise, but can you flick it to me?
Yep, just doing
or just
that
the
right
same
now.
one I have.
Yeah, that one will work. Yep. Yeah, no, I emailed it through, but that's all right. It's lovely to see you, Robert. Thank you so much. Here's Natalia now.
Bernard.
And so shall I let? Oh yeah, cool. Natalia's.
Oh, fabulous! There she is.
Robert, thank you. Lovely to see you.
Hi there.
Probably
All
went
right,
straight
thank
into
you.
your spam. So look,
It did go
welcome
straight
to
to my
New Zealand's.
spam. Apologies.
Yeah, forgive me. No, welcome to New Zealand's most important news podcast. You have Professor Robert Patman, who is a friend of the pod, as we say, in this global podcasting world. You've also got Bernard Hickey, who is my co-host, or I'm the co-host on his podcast, and we're just thrilled to have you in from Tbilisi in Georgia to discuss Putin, why we need to think about Georgia, what the precedent of Georgia shows for how we need to think about Ukraine. And of course, you've got experience in tracking Putin now, tracking Russia's behavior for many years. So tell us. Robert is a professor of international studies at Oxford University, Otago University in New Zealand, which is the Otago of the Oxford of the Southern Hemisphere. Natalia, you're the co-founder of Coda Story. You're sitting in Tbilisi. You've just gone through a really interesting crisis in Tbilisi with the government, which I think you would argue is somewhat Russian influenced, certainly oligarch influenced, which tried to bring in a foreign agent law, i.e., deciding that local media, human rights groups, and so on, very much like they've done in Russia, but the government decided not to push it through in the end. What's going on in Georgia that we should think about right now? And then we'll talk about the 2008 invasion a little bit.
I think hi, first of all, and real pleasure to be here. Sorry for being a bit late. I think the most important, kind of the easiest way to understand what's going on to Georgia is to think of it as really the second front of the war in Ukraine. And it's very telling how Georgian public perceives that war in Ukraine. Ask any Georgian, most of them will probably blank on, like, I don't know who is the Minister of Infrastructure of Georgia at the moment, but they will tell you who it is in Ukraine. I mean, every minister, like, is a household name. Every detail of the war is being very closely followed. There are Georgians who are fighting in Ukraine, and there is very much, the city is full of Ukrainian flags. There is a very, very clear sense of feeling that this is Georgia's war too, and that's because Georgia has been there many times. Also because Georgia and Ukraine has always sided historically against Russia as an oppressor. And Ukrainians have fought in the wars that Georgia has fought against Russia in the 90s and so on. So there's a lot of history there. But while there is that very clear sense of alignment with Ukraine among the public, Georgia also has a government that takes a very different position. And they take a very different position. They can't do it very openly because the country is very, both pro-Ukraine and pro-Western. And the reason
public.
it is the public. And it's almost hard. Georgia is a tiny place that is stuck between, and has been stuck for it throughout its history, between these giant neighbors who have always come through and invaded. And the country has survived despite the odds, whether it's been the Persians, the Mongols, the Persians, the Turks, most recently the Russians. And since the independence of the Soviet Union, of Georgia from the Soviet Union, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the country has made a very clear choice that it wanted, the only way for Georgia to protect its sovereignty, and to stay as a state, was to choose a Western path, basically align itself with the West, align itself with Europe, align itself
which it did really, even under Shevardnadze, and then certainly under Saakashvili, once
very
independence
much
came.
so.
So what's happened now with
since
this new
Shevardnadze,
regime?
that's been a constant. In
Yeah.
2012, the new government, which is elected by the Georgian people, this is a initially at least a democratically elected government. In 2012, the elections that we've had since have been very dubious on many levels, but there is no question that there's been enough public support for them. They never publicly changed the geopolitical course of the country, a course that is written into the country's constitution, right? The Georgian constitution says, they are the future of Georgia is with
With Europe.
with Europe as with the West. But this government is run in the government, the current government, the Georgian Dream, so-called Georgian Dream Party, is run by a man, an oligarch who made all of his money in Russia. He came to power in 2011, and he very slowly, but very
But he's
steadily and
doing it
surely-
remotely, isn't he, Natalia? He's not
No,
actually
he's in the
Parliament.
country.
Yeah. No, but he's not doing
no,
it.
that's right. No, he's not in Parliament. He's a puppet master, right? He's the godfather figure. He's the ultimate godfather figure. He's richer than anyone else in the country. He's rich. Yeah, he has more money than the country, and so there's no competition whatsoever. It makes it a really unique situation, kind of globally.
Yeah.
Well, how do you get rid of someone like that? And he has, over the years, basically destroyed the opposition with their own help as well. He has very kind of surely and steadily taken the country off the Western path without declaring that he's doing that publicly, because he he couldn't do that. And he kind of, returned it to the Soviet path, pushed it closer and closer towards Russia, and that became especially apparent since the war in Ukraine, because I think the government of Georgia, he personally, I suspect, and the government in general that is working for him, rather than for Georgia's interests, as we have seen recently, they have taken a very ambivalent position on Ukraine without openly saying that, we're not for this war, but very much.
Are they
very
still
much
letting
saying we don't want to
Russians?
be part of it.
Sorry, are they still letting Russians who want to avoid the draft come into Georgia? Because that was a big phenomenon a couple of months ago when it was clear that there was going to be another mass mobilization. Are they still allowing Russians to come in to escape
Oh yeah,
the
the Russians
draft?
are still coming in. That sort of tsunami that we saw happen in September, there were two massive waves. One when the war started, lots of Russians came in, fleeing the war, or fleeing the inconveniences of the Putin's increasingly authoritarian regime. And their new lives under sanctions, and some genuinely fleeing because it became too dangerous, because everyone was declared a foreign agent. So lots of these people came, sort of people in opposition to the war, to Putin, and then we had another massive wave in September when Russians declared the full mobilization, and they're still coming in and out, but. Yeah, there
And
are
if
no
we go
like
back a
waves
little
like
bit
that.
to 2008, and this is where Robert, we might bring Professor Patman in as well with you, because I find it so interesting. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot, Robert basically lives on this podcast with us, which we're very grateful for, is the idea of a frozen conflict. And of course, in 2008, Russia intervened to bring back, Abkhazia into and took, I think, 25% of Georgian territory, fought against Georgia. My recollection is that Sarkozy, I think it was, tried to come in and intervene. Saakashvili was the president at the time. You're living adjacent to one of these. Part of your country is one of these frozen conflicts. One of the great Coda stories that I've read and I mentioned to people is the little old man who lives on the border, and the Russian soldiers who at night come and creep out and put the border another meter or two further out. It's a really intimidating thing to have this frozen conflict just right there.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, frozen conflict is a very convenient term for Russians themselves, and I think it's really important to understand that what's happening in Ukraine today did not start in February of 2022. It was, wasn't it? It didn't start in 2014 when Russians annexed Crimea. It started in 2008 with the Russian invasion of Georgia, but arguably it started even earlier, back in the 1990s, when Russians, determined to keep the pieces of empire in some shape or form. Obviously, Russia itself was in complete chaos, but so many of the things that we see playing out in Ukraine today are from the playbook that Russia started writing in the 1990s, which is, find a tiny existing tension, fan the flames of it, turn it into a conflict, play a role of a peacekeeper.
It's exactly what they did in the Donbass, and
Exactly. They did it in Georgia with Abkhazia, in South Ossetia. They did it. They've done it with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Slightly different conflict. It was two countries rather, three countries rather than now more. So, each of these conflicts has its own, obviously, nuances and peculiarities and so on. But ultimately, a Russian role in them is almost identical. Stir up
Robert,
trouble and then come in as someone who is like saving everyone and freeze the conflict. And having just the very last point, it's really important to understand that having living as a country living with a frozen conflict is basically being a person living with an amputated limb. You can't fully develop or become what it is that you want to become.
And you never know. You must never know what the next step is going to be. Robert, what do you think about this concept of the? We see it now with the attempts to destabilize Moldova. We've seen it in Ukraine, obviously, with the Donbass instance, for years now, and the invasion of Crimea. There's a number of these kind of pressure points that Putin is extremely skillful at manipulating.
Yes, thank you very much, Natalia. That was really fascinating. Mr. Putin, of course, in terms of declaratory policy, has always claimed it's NATO enlargement that has led to the sort of encroachments that Natalia has just been articulating and outlining for us. Whereas, in fact, I think really, Russia's imperial ambitions, indeed, it's a determination to establish a sphere of influence, is the real reason. And this is what we're seeing in both Georgia and in Ukraine at the moment. Mr. Putin's definition of friendly neighbors in the near abroad is neighbors which are responsive to Russian influence, and particularly the influence of his regime. There's 2 points here which I think we need to bring out. Firstly, Mr. Putin's regime is a deeply unattractive one in political terms, and therefore he has to resort to coercive, albeit covert, interference in the neighbors, because in a sense, of course, he's fearful about Western influence because the alternative that his regime presents is deeply unattractive. He has monopolized political power for 22 years, which is hardly an easy sell when you're trying to influence and make friends overseas or in the near abroad. I think the second point to make with regard to this is that Mr. Putin is extremely worried about democratic evolution in Georgia, Ukraine. Why? Because ultimately it's all about regime survival for Mr. Putin. He's killed too many people in Russia to go to a comfortable retirement. Therefore, he has to basically look to stay in power as long as possible. And I think what really rattled him, I'd be interested to hear Natalia's point of view about this, was, the protests, the popular protests that occurred in Belarus and also in Kazakhstan in the last 2 years, because it was almost, it must have been to Mr. Putin, you can imagine almost the panic in the Kremlin, that from his point of view, while countries like Ukraine are around and they're democratic, there's always the threat that ideas will cross borders and inspire young people in Moscow and elsewhere. So I think, in a sense, this interference is done out of weakness, not strength. The Russian political system under Mr. Putin is unattractive, and therefore that's the only way, really, the regime can project influence, by picking up issues and basically stirring the pot and backing people with money and money and support that is favourable to the Russian line in these respective countries, whether it be in Georgia or Ukraine. And secondly, I think the regime is extremely nervous. I mean, Mr. Putin's worst nightmare must be the democratic development of Russia's neighbours, because that will only increase, I think, the prospect of some sort of, groundswell of opposition in Russia. And it's very interesting to me that a number of Western diplomats and commentators have basically bought into the line articulated by the Kremlin that it was NATO enlargement that's driving all these troubles, and that if NATO hadn't expanded, Mr. Putin would have been having very amicable relations with Georgia, with all these other countries, which I don't really think is true.
Natalia, what does that sound like to you? I mean, Robert's a highly skilled academic. You're living in one of these countries, and also you and your team report on it, about Russia, from Russia, as much as you can. Does that sound like a sort of logical view about Putin's approach? Is it just this kind of, is he concerned about what's happening on the borders? Because it was very noticeable to me with those Georgian protests the other day. There seemed to be a very young side of it. It really seemed to be young people, but maybe that was a mistake.
No, the way young people, I think the point that Robert is making is basically, the total bullseye. Absolutely. That whole myth that has been built around NATO enlargement, and the way that plenty of academics in the West, people on, both kind of the less so on the right, interestingly, but more so now is the shoehorn kind of joins up, but especially left of the spectrum have bought into that argument that, well, it's the NATO enlargement. That is just simply not true. First of all, the idea that Russia should be threatened by, Ukraine or Georgia joining NATO. Really? Look at the map. Look at how much territory Russia's got. What has got Russia to worry about? That's one. And secondly, the only reason that countries like Ukraine and Georgia want to join NATO is because that's the only way they can protect themselves from Russia.
Because they've got experience.
Georgia, because they know what it exactly. And Georgia, and that's something that never gets really mentioned or talked about. Under Saakashvili, Georgia was Saakashvili's government made it very clear that Georgia was happy to give up its NATO aspirations for return of its territorial integrity, for return of the breakaway provinces, and never join NATO again. Never talk about joining NATO. The response to that was the Russian invasion. And I remember covering the war in Georgia, the shells of bombs that fell on Georgian villages and towns had often handwritten, just white handwritten painted signs for NATO. So so that whole myth that was built, like it's all about NATO, it's all about NATO, you know, I mean, yeah, it has become about it, but we need to look at the root cause of the problem here, and yeah, and the fact that, like, this is actually about sovereignty. It's not about NATO's imperial expansion. It's about the right of countries that feel threatened to decide who their friends are, who can
Natalia,
help them
you
protect
have
their
great
sovereignty.
contacts, good contacts in inside Russia. What level of you know, we also know that those people from Medusa and so on who try to report about Russia from now outside as exiles, what level of resistance or disagreement is visible or happening inside Russia? And I'm asking this because somebody in our
It's a
chat
very
has asked it.
it's a very depressing question. I think what's palpable is, and again, I speak as someone who is outside, but I am talking to people in Russia and a lot of people who are going in and out, and many Russians. What's palpable is not the resistance. What's palpable is acceptance of the war. And that's the scariest thing about this war and about what the future holds, because I think the majority, you know, this is often referred to as Putin's war. Sadly, I think it's Russia's war. I think most Russians have gone along with it. I think the ones who didn't agree with it have got out, but there are plenty of people who got out who actually don't mind the war so much. They just want the convenience of living somewhere. So yeah, I don't think there's much. I mean, there are incredibly brave individuals who, you know, this video I was watching, this video went around yesterday of this like lone guy on a Russian street with a placard that says "Hug me if you're against the war," and there's people coming up to him
The
and
cops,
hugging him.
yeah.
And he was arrested, of course. I mean, the level of repression is unbelievable. There's no question that is incredibly dangerous to protest publicly in Russia in any way. But I also don't feel, you know, Russians have adopted this. Look, I have relatives in Moscow who are one of those people. They've adopted this, not ethnic Russians either, but they've adopted this sort of safe style of like, we are beyond politics. We're not interested in politics, and we're just, you know, this is something that's happening in parallel. We're just living our lives, and that is more kind of more widespread than I
A
think it was in
survival
the Soviet
mechanism. Yeah.
Union. And it is, you can call it a survival mechanism. It's but it's ultimately, it's an incredibly dangerous complacency that got
And
us to where we are today.
speaking, Natalia, I'm going to do this for Bernard because it'll bring in Robert as well. The Xi Jinping visit, these two alleged chums and the two alleged best friends. Robert, what do you make of what you've seen from it? And then I'll ask Natalia the same question.
I think China is conflicted because on the one hand, it doesn't want to see the collapse of the Putin regime, because after all, Xi Jinping seems to have had about 39 or 40 meetings with Vladimir Putin since Xi came to power. And so he probably sees this authoritarian regime in Moscow as a junior partner. And so I think there's an expression of solidarity with Putin. On the other hand, Mr. Xi and his foreign policy advisor, chief foreign policy advisor, have received direct warnings from both the United States and the EU, I think two of the three biggest export markets for China, that should they arm Mr. Putin's military, then there'll be severe sanctions which will affect China's exports to both the US and the EU. And I don't think these are idle threats. And the Chinese leadership know that this would have severe political problems for Xi's leadership in China. So I think you know, in a sense, Xi is sort of talking tough, supporting this illegal invasion of of Ukraine, trying to play the peacemaker, although he must know that his brand of neutrality doesn't, cut it basically internationally. So I think the Chinese position, I found the meeting between Putin and Xi, looking at it and reading about it, very interesting, because there seems to be fast tracking an agreement for a joint venture to send Russian energy, oil and gas, to China, which is an interesting development. But, we still haven't seen any tangible sign that China is actually increasing its military support for Russia. I stand to be corrected. I don't know. That seems to be the view at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think China has shot itself in the foot in terms of global opinion, or at least in opinion within the liberal democratic area, because they seem to me. I think there's quite a big division within China, within the Chinese leadership, about Xi backing Putin, because after all, what Mr. Putin is doing is undermining some of the core principles of Chinese foreign policy, which is respect for territorial integrity and state sovereignty, which is, after all, Chinese claims to Taiwan and Hong Kong always are based on those principles. So it's puzzling. Maybe Xi just sees political advantage in consolidating Putin as a junior partner, trying to give him what support he can. I think, the Chinese have always seen Russia as a junior partner. It's very much a marriage of convenience. But I'm puzzled why Xi has gone to the lengths he's already gone, because Mr. Putin's in deep trouble, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive will come.
Robert, just diving a bit more into that relationship between Russia and China, and I was struck in listening to Natalia. Natalia used the phrase complacency and talked about what an authoritarian government system, how it operates, which in New Zealand, we just sort of it's hard to imagine. I mean, we feel confident saying pretty much anything to anyone, and we could put a sign around our neck and know that we weren't going to be arrested.
Well, it depends on the sign, but yeah.
Yeah. But Robert, the Australians are taking a much more robust, and some would say here, too strong a view about pushing back at China. What's your view on, AUKUS, the acquisition of nuclear submarines, and whether New Zealand should be just as robust as the Australians and be less complacent about China?
But are they being robust? I mean, the argument is, I'm not convinced that joining AUKUS is the best way to counter Chinese influence. The crucial thing we have to note here is that some of the countries which are even more concerned about Chinese assertiveness, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, do not see AUKUS, three English-speaking countries, coming together and declaring that they're going to protect the rules-based order for Indo-Pacific, which is 60% of the world's population. A better arrangement would be a much more inclusive arrangement, which brought together all countries which felt threatened by China. China is actually using AUKUS as a bit of a propaganda gift, reminding countries in the region that the British have form in the Indo-Pacific, its imperial past, and the Americans have a track record which is questionable with regard to their participation in the Vietnam War. So actually, it seems to me that AUKUS, in a sense, it's commendable that it's sending a message to China, but I'm not sure it's an effective message, and I'm not sure it's the best way or the most effective way of countering China's influence. It seems a bit like a coalition of the willing, as opposed to a robust, broad-based, multilateral arrangement.
Natalia, how do you read the Xi meetings?
Yeah, that's interesting, because
I won't ask you about
I
AUKUS
don't
yet, because that's too weird for you. But
Thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll skip my opinion. It's worth skipping my opinions on orcas, but I don't completely agree on the on one point that Robert makes, that China has shot itself in the foot when it comes to the global order. I think what is happening, I think my reading of it is that China was on a fence for a really long time. I think China was pissed off about this invasion at the start because I mean, the two have clearly built a very much closer relationship through the pandemic, and apparently the diplomatic traffic between Moscow and Beijing throughout the pandemic was through the roof. There was a lot was going on, and in our reporting, we definitely saw it was in that period during the pandemic that we saw a much more unified messaging from the Russian, the Chinese, and then subsequently the Iranian state media outlets. I mean, we now regularly see that a message pushed out by the Russians will be picked up and spread
That's
far
so
and
interesting.
wide
Yeah,
by the
I mean,
Chinese and the Iranians as well. And I think we should not underestimate how much that message is heard outside of the Western
absolutely.
world.
Yeah.
Africa, Asia, parts of Latin America. I think Latin America is different, and I don't understand it as well. But I think that message in Africa, for example, Russia's message really resonates. Russian soft power really resonates, and much of the world is on the fence about Ukraine. For some of it, for very good reasons, because it is seen as the West's pet project, and it's seen as a proxy war.
Yeah, it's so
And
interesting, isn't it? Because what I've done also, Natalia, is I've shared with everybody codastory.com, but you run a special disinformation newsletter which really deals with some of these issues about how information is spread in this way and how effective as a tool it is.
Yeah, that's right. And we track a lot of this, sort of patterns and themes. And I think the narratives that have emerged, and Russia has always positioned itself as the anti-colonial global power, which looks ridiculous if you're sitting in Georgia or Estonia or Ukraine, but sells very well if you're in Mali and your problem are the French, right?
Yeah.
And they have really doubled down on that since the war,
I
and
think we might have to come back to that. Yeah.
incredibly, it has worked.
So, Natalia, Robert, thank you so much for coming on. Natalia, particularly
Thank
to you, I really appreciate it. I know it's a favor to me, and I really greatly appreciate it. We
Absolute
usually finish
pleasure.
with a skateboarding dog, which this week is actually slightly a bit more gloomy than a skateboarding dog, and it's really about AI and Donald Trump. So, Donald Trump last week announced that he believed he was going to be indicted this week, and of course it hasn't happened. Was it ever going to happen? It's unclear. Might it still happen? That's unclear too. But the extent to which the DA in Manhattan is now being attacked by the Republican movement shows that initial work by Trump really paid off. And I'm just going to share my screen. And hang on.
I can actually put in as well the link to there's a PBS story which talks about it.
And I'm just going to show you, hopefully, oh God, the previews that hang on. This is a bit of a classic. It's what we yeah. You can now see my entire bloody, yep. No, not Sewell Chan. That's the wrong one. Coming. God, here we go. Those are pictures of Donald Trump meeting. Can you see those? Meeting Darth Vader and the character from Alien and so on. And what prompted those is this, which are these rather extraordinarily AI-produced pictures this week, which are entirely fake and well labeled here as fake, of Donald Trump being arrested, and there are hundreds of them. And if you look at look on the internet, you can find them. And so I think this is a really interesting warning of what we have to expect. or as Bernard would say, what we can now look forward to for the real picture of Trump being indicted in a couple of weeks. But thank you very much, everybody, for participating and putting up with our little wrinkle from time to time.
Well, I was thrilled at, and apart from anything else, I think what we've learned is that for an audience who want to talk to each other and see much better pictures that are more reliable, YouTube's live stream is the way to go.
And we will have to work out a chat on there as well. But thank you so much, Robert, as usual. You're a marvelous person to have. And Natalia, if you don't mind, I might connect you to Robert, because I think you'd be a very interesting pair. And it's lovely to see you, Natalia, and I'll see you shortly.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Natalia.
much,
and we'll
Bernard.
link out the
Nice weekend.
podcast to everyone with
Thank
your
you.
Twitter handles and things. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. And ka kite
Thank you.
anō.